The topic of tonight is gender in Buddhism, and I happen to be of the female gender. And I never thought that much about being of the female gender until Buddhism. Very interesting experience, even though in theory, well, not in theory, actuality, actually, we're working to transcend pretty much any kind of self-identity that we have, gender being one of them. But there are certain identities that perhaps we're not terribly attached to, yet they have a sort of implication and a sort of echo in our life, whether we like it or not. Simply because we have a shape and form that means a particular thing or a particular, there's a particular identification in the outer world or particular definitions in the outer world that whether or not you identify with, they are placed upon you. So as we mentioned over and over again with these live streams, but pretty much in any decent Buddhist book that you open or any decent sort of talk that a Buddhist monastic talks about, we're always talking about in one shape or form about emptiness, of how pretty much everything is empty of inherent existence and empty of a particular self. So it's quite interesting because my name is Soma, and I get my name from Bhikkhuni Soma, who was one of the disciples of the Buddha, who one of the early female arhats, and happened to be also the protagonist of one of my favorite suttas in the Bhikkhuni Samyutta. There is the Bhikkhuni Soma Sutta. And actually, the Bhikkhuni Samyutta is one of my favorite. Actually, I always say that with every sutta, so I'm probably very little credible by now. But I actually find it quite charming, not necessarily because of the gender of the practitioners, but rather because it's all these stories of really badass monastics that are tempted by Mara. And Mara comes while they're meditating and tries to stray them from concentration, from practicing the Dharma, by sort of presenting them with some sort of facts that he think, or facts or ideas that he think will, persuade the practitioners from following his path rather than following the path of the Buddha. So as Bhikkhuni Soma is practicing, Mara appears and he's all like, what are you doing there? You're a woman. I'm paraphrasing. The sutta is much better, so you should actually read the sutta. But anyway, he goes up to her and goes like, what are you doing there? You're a woman. Women are known not to have any wisdom or very little wisdom. He calls it the two-finger, right? Wisdom, which apparently, according to some commentary, it was because back in the time of the Buddha, women would cook rice and check if the rice was cooked by putting them in the two fingers. It's like, that's the kind of wisdom that women have, the two-finger wisdom of checking whether the rice is cooked or not. Bhikkhuni Soma, it's like, who is this? Is this a human being or a non-human being? And she's like, this is Mara, the evil one, coming here to stray me from concentration. And then she looks at him and goes like, what does womanhood have anything to do at all when the mind is concentrated well and one sees right through Dhamma? One who thinks, I'm a woman, I'm a man or I'm anything at all is fit for Mara to address. And Mara disappears like that in 1 second because he understands that Bhikkhuni Soma sees me. I can't fool her. And I remember reading the sutta and going, yeah, Bhikkhuni Soma. She's great. And actually, all the suttas, I was pretty much like, yeah, like they're all great. But this one in particular, I quite liked also because it was, I read it at a time where gender was kind of presented to me. And actually back then I thought it was like pretty strongly, but in hindsight, it was actually like very, very tuned, tamed, you know, it wasn't that big of a deal back then, like the experiences that I was having. So I was kind of like, yeah, whatever, you know. It's not something that is particularly, I mean, this is the right attitude, this is the practice, this is the path. And you'll find throughout the canon, actually, this is one of the incredible things about Buddhism, that of the Buddhist teachings rather than Buddhism, where the Buddha really challenges every kind of idea that we have of ourselves, and we start realizing the futility of it. And the gratification, the danger, and the escape in every single thing that we grasp, we gravitate towards. But at the same time, once again, being a female monastic, putting these robes on has sort of increasingly, it's been my experience that gender has increasingly played a role in my experience. And to the point where I reached a kind of a situation where I was not quite understanding what was Buddhism and what was actually sort of contamination of the Buddhist teachings or ideas or unenlightened. What was the way towards enlightenment and what was not fruitful towards awakening. And it's very interesting because when you see the past 2,500 years, there's very, very, very little literature in terms of women. So there's lots of male monastics, starting obviously from the Buddha all the way up to today, and very few glimpses, even though in the Pali Canon there's actually still obviously the majority is male gendered, but there is quite a substantial presence of female monastics represented, definitely more than the average religion, I would say, the average religious texts, but still substantially numerically inferior in comparison to the literature or the perspectives that one has in terms of gender, in terms of the male gender. And when you hear about notable practitioners, notable teachers, lineages, whatever you name it, the majority, that's 99.9%, is of the male gender, which is kind of interesting, right? Even though the Buddha said over and over again how something like gender was not a problem to attain awakening, yet the majority of the practitioners that we hear of are male. And in these contexts, you're also presented with some ideas like, if you have this kind of body, perhaps your karmic situation is not as great as having a different body. which is completely absurd, nothing that the Buddha ever said. But it's presented to you there. It's also presented in terms of facts. Well, if there were more, if women were actually more talented, then you would actually have more representation, wouldn't you? But it was quite interesting because a few months ago, Bante and I were in Southeast Asia traveling, and we went to several different places. There was an interesting stark difference of how people were relating to him versus myself. And we started this organization together. So it was quite interesting how very, very few people were open to hearing what I had to say, but everybody was open to hearing what he had to say. And we were traveling with two other male monks. And at a certain point, we were at this quite famous monastery. And even though Bante kept on saying how we had started this organization together over and over again and tried to include me, at a certain point, they took a picture of all of us. And when we came back to the US, we saw this picture on Facebook, and there is, they had cropped me out. Kind of amusing. Tragicomic in the way that there is Bante, I'm here to the left, removed, and then there are the two other monks. And it's the three American monks who had started Buddhist Insights in the US. And I was like, wow, it is very interesting how I don't exist. I've been erased, completely washed out. Oh, how peculiar. And that gave me a glimpse to kind of understand what has happened not only 2 months ago, but basically for the past 2,500 years. So it's not that women practitioners haven't practiced, haven't been there. It's just that we don't have any history of them. And so I've started actually this research and trying to understand what gender means. What are the implications of having this body in order to transcend it? And I came to the precious realization that in order to transcend something, you need to know it. And it's no different with anything that we practice with in Buddhism. In order to transcend suffering, you need to understand how you suffer. You need to understand what is the suffering. Otherwise, what are you transcending? Nothing. It becomes an empty platitude and you keep on running around in circles. So the First Noble Truth is very important. It's important to understand why we are treated in a particular way, depending on our conditions, and why we are treating others depending on conditions. So in this sort of situation of extreme suffering, actually, I won't deny it, it's been pretty difficult. It's been sort of, with everything in Buddhism, it's been like this, started a little bit difficult, but everything becomes easier. This one has been like this, like, whoa, and you're like, okay, it can't be worse than this. Worse, worse. Like, it's a lot. Sometimes it's very intense. And at a certain point, I was like, seriously, I thought this was the path of liberation. And it can be. It is obviously the Buddhist path is the path of liberation, get me wrong, but when we encounter such big obstacles and such big challenges, we have to be really careful to avoid them crushing us. And the way that I'm finding some sort of solace and strength, because what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, is from deeply understanding, both through the aid of other women who before me have done the work, through just my own observations, my own investigation, my own contemplation of reality. So really, I actually name drop Rita Gross, who passed away a few years ago, and who was an incredible Buddhist practitioner in the Vajrayana tradition and a disciple of one of my favorite teachers in the Tibetan tradition, Venerable Tandro Rinpoche, female also, Bhikkhuni. And she was also a feminist and a scholar. And so she actually did incredible research, incredible production of literature that I'm currently studying to make sense of like, what is my experience here? Because it's also like, we find Buddhism in different forms and in different cultures. So trying to really understand what is the place of all of this without just rejecting everything outright, and really kind of getting the nuts and bolts. And I find it very useful because then you start also depersonalizing it. It's not, for example, that the people who cropped me out of the picture thought that I was awful, thought that I was ugly, thought that I was like stupid, thought that I was not important, but they were acting based on their own conditioning, based on causes and conditions. And by the way, I think actually the person who cropped me out was a woman. So there's also this kind of discovery that one makes. It's that not necessarily whenever we talk about these systems of oppression, it's just that, oh, I'm a woman oppressed by men. No, I'm a woman oppressed by men, by other women, and I'm also a woman that oppresses sometimes other men. So let's kind of really be honest with all of this sort of situation. And also, it's very important to do this work to understand how gender influences who we think we are. Perhaps we don't have, like myself, a big attachment. We didn't used to, like didn't used to have a big attachment towards the female gender per se, but yet I was born with this body. Yet I was born in one of the, as I always like to say, sexist and sexiest countries in the world, Italy. So it's definitely, there's a lot of chauvinism in the country where I come from. And even though I made choices in my life that led me to be surrounded by people who were, pretty woke, I guess you can say, not awakened, but pretty woke. I had a different experience perhaps of gender, but I was still raised as a woman, still raised in a context that had certain expectations on me based on what I looked like. So this whole journey within Buddhism really made me reflect. For example, since we started this organization, up until very recently, if you see all the brochures, all of everything that Buddhist Insights has produced, you see only Bhante Sudaso. And this is not because Bhante Sudaso was like, I am the only one who's going to be here, like whenever we do something public. Actually, most of the time he was doing quite the opposite. He was saying, come on, if there's an interview, you should be here, you should be present. And I was like, no, I like being behind the scenes. This is also what I did as a profession before time. If there were retreats, I liked being in the kitchen, I liked making food. So when he's doing things that I actually really enjoy doing, it's my decision to do that. And, there's partly it's true. Partly that was true. But at the same time, I started kind of going, how true is that? Is it because perhaps by having this body, we're kind of indoctrinated to be a little bit behind the scenes, to be a little bit mousy, to be a little bit not disturbing too much, to be supportive, to play some sort of roles? It's a very interesting question. So then as I started taking this other form as a monastic, then it's been my work to actually shift a lot of this suffering that I was experiencing in terms of gender, to shift it towards awakening. So instead of thinking, oh, I like to cook and I like to be downstairs and I dislike being in front of a camera and I dislike being in pictures, thinking instead, what is needed? What is necessary? What does it represent for other women who come to this space to see the same sort of predicament replicated here, whether I like it or not, whether it actually things are different or not? What does it mean for others? Perhaps out of compassion, we should create different, for others, we should create different sort of setups. And I found that extremely beneficial for my practice, to become a little bit less self-centered, less, I want to do that. I don't want to do that. Also less obsessed with all like my sort of creative ambitions and creative, other self-identities that I had. I didn't have the gender one that strong, but I had a lot of other self-identities very, very marked. I still do. So it's very great work of practice when we stop self-obsessing and thinking, how can my life be useful, be beneficial for others? And that is when this approach is what brings openness in my mind to fully understand also what the Buddha was talking about in terms of gender. So there's this beautiful sutta in the Vasita Sutta where the Buddha talks about not only gender, but pretty much any kind of sort of distinction that we make amongst humans based on either class, race, once again, gender. And he defines them all as conventions. What he says is that we can see differences between classes of beings, but within each class of beings, there is no salient difference. And when we look at animals, actually, that is one of the things that strikes us the most, the majority of animals. We have a fox, for example, here that comes and visits repeatedly. Some people refer to her as she, like I do. Some people refer to her as he. The majority of cats and birds, we have no idea whether they're female or male, but we definitely know it's a bird. We definitely know it's a fox. We definitely know it's a cat. Whether it's female or male becomes a little bit irrelevant. We can only really tell if it's a deer, for example, it has a big thing, or a lion, but the majority, we don't. And still, even there, it's just deer. It's just lions. It's a class of beings with particular sort of details. So we see how in humans, we create a big deal in our existence of things that actually are empty of inherent existence. So the more it gets close to home, the more we start looking at differences. It's been a great learning experience for me as an Italian living in this country for now over 11 years. All of a sudden being grouped in this like big box of white people which is completely unimaginable where I come from. Because someone who's Italian from Southern Europe, being in the same box with someone from Sweden, like we look completely different in our imaginary. Yet here we don't. Actually, we had some recently. There were some residents here, one from Asia, both from Asia, and one from Burma and one from China. And actually, Banka Sanata Vihari, who is American of Mexican descent, he was here and we were talking, and they were like, that he actually checks a different box, right, than the white box. And the two of them were like, you look the same. You're all white people. So it's kind of interesting how, both what we think we are and what we, how people can be very much grouped. And in this place where there is, not one single ethnicity that has lived here. Actually, there is one single ethnicity that has been living here for quite some time. But there's lots of them, the majority that haven't really been here for that long. So there's not one main kind of group of people. And it's just really doesn't matter if you're from Sweden or from Italy. You're just like a white person. It doesn't really matter if you're from Korea, you're from China, or you're from Thailand. You're just an Asian person. It doesn't matter if you're from Africa, or you're from Jamaica, or like wherever you are, you're just a Black person. But really bizarre that you have all these but you go where I come from, we are extremely divisive. There's the Northern Italians, we're very different from the Southern Italians. And if you go within the Southern town, this person from this town is very different from that other town. And within the town, the person from that borough is very different from the other borough. There's so many different definitions that to the majority of people, they just don't matter because we're an entire big class of beings. So that's where we can start seeing the emptiness, and we also can start seeing the suffering that comes whenever we put too much importance and too much we attach to it. We think it's really like solid. But also, it's very important to have a real understanding of what are components and current conditions. What are the implications, once again, in society? And really being able to call bullshit when we see bullshit, especially when we are in religious circles. The biggest precious teaching that I've had out of all this stuff that I experienced in the past years has been this revelation of how much bullshit I've been able to tolerate and swallow and accept because it was masked on because it was a religious setting. I realized that a lot of things that I kind of like played along with, I would have never accepted and tolerated if it had not been Buddhism. Yet I tolerated for a particular sort of situations or took them into consideration because they were presented to me under the guise, is that English? Of Buddhism, something that I have deep faith in, the teachings of the Buddha. But then it occurred to me how Buddhism and the teachings of the Buddha have a lot of overlap, but sometimes they're not quite the same thing. And just like we are very objective most of the time when we see other religions, and they say bullshit, or when it's not a religious context and we see the bullshit, we call it bullshit. So we should within, it's our duty to call it like it is. And the Buddha, by the way, does it all the time. He always calls bullshit whenever he was presented with things like the caste system, like that one was inferior or superior by birth. Like, that's bullshit. Yeah, so let's call it bullshit. It's our duty as Buddhist practitioners to present the truth. We call it bullshit with a mind of loving kindness, but we still call it bullshit. And whenever there is some sort of conflict with human rights, it's very big, much worth an investigation. Because I have to say, I realized that also the reason why I didn't have to worry most of the time in my adult life about gender was because of the work that other women have done in the past in order to give me this privileged existence. Where in other parts of the world, as I have experienced, that's not a right at all. It's not present. So yes, I have now incredible gratitude for things that before I gave for granted. So the incredible amount of work that has been done in the human rights field, something that we need to treasure, consider, value, and relate to. And also bring up and create spaces where everyone can practice. Because the amount of suffering that any type of discrimination is based has produced in everywhere. You know, another beautiful teaching that I got from all the awful sort of experiences that I've had based on discrimination on gender was truly understanding, for example, I have lots of friends from the gay community that are my best friends, and had an awful relationship with the Vatican. In Italy, obviously, the land of the Vatican, which I understood back. I always understood, but up to a certain extent, because it wasn't really hitting home. And now I understood what it feels like to be discriminated, to be treated like a third-class citizen. And that is horrible. It's heartbreaking. It's something that no one ever should be put in that situation and deprived of the teachings of liberation in whatever tradition. I've been so close so many times to just drop everything, being disillusioned by the path, and then having to realize that actually that was not the path. The path are the teachings of the Buddha. And any element that discriminates on people is not the teachings of the Buddha. The teachings of the Buddha bring liberation. They don't bring oppression for anyone. So, I guess that's all I had to say in my stream of consciousness today. Hopefully, Venerable Calico went for Dana like after 5 minutes. All right.
Well, thank you very much, Ayyā. That was wonderful. And Bhante Calico was here the whole time, writing comments more or less continuously.
Ooh.
And actually, there's tons and tons of comments, so I might not be able to read out all the comments for Ayyā, but I'll try to hit the highlights. And there's a few questions already, but if there's more questions, please go ahead and type in some more questions, and I'll read those out for her as well. So, scrolling back up to the top, what do we have? So when you were reading the Soma Sutta, Gabriella said, Mara's a dirty sexist. That was great. A lot of appreciation for the Soma Sutta. James was horrified that they cropped you out of the photo. Stacy said, that's really shocking.
Have incredible Photoshop skills, though.
Well, they just had to cut off the left 25% of the photo, so it wasn't that amazing. Bante Kaliko says, Buddhism really needs to deal with its historical and current misogyny and mistreatment of women. We need to be aware of sexism in our institutions and call it out. Men have a role to play in this. Marielle says, I mean, it's the same in almost all the fields. Women have been doing everything since forever. It's only that unwholesome misogynist writers wrote history. And that just shows a lot of a lack of self-reflection. It is useless to study and practice that there is no self and that we should respect others if we do not understand the different spaces where this can be applied, even if those spaces are so-called normal. Yeah. Yeah, a really interesting thing on that note that was pointed out by Reverend Phoebe, a monastic from the Zen tradition, was that historically, whenever a female Zen practitioner became a famous teacher, then the history books would record her as being male. So we actually don't know how many of the Zen masters and Chan masters of the past were female because of this custom of always referring to them as men.
Yeah, similarly in the Tibetan tradition, well, similar but different. All the yoginis that you hear about, or most of them anyway, you hear about them only when one of their disciples or a few of their disciples were men. So then the men, if they became really good practitioners, then they would write about their teacher. So those are the only times when you have, recorded stories.
And Victor mentions that one time he took 2 female monastics and a group of lay people to visit a Thai temple. And the old ladies at the Thai temple were not comfortable with them being there. He said the monk was actually fine with the female monastics, but the old ladies at the temple were not fine with it.
Yeah, absolutely. There is an internalized misogyny, which is another thing that I learned. With Buddhism, I got woke. Now I'm waiting for awakening. So I learned a lot of different definitions and what they mean, and actually like experientially. So yes, one of the first things is also to check. But also, what we're talking about now in gender, one should see in everything, in sexual preferences, in race. So also understanding how, if we have a certain body, how are we playing along with it in one shape or form? And, and to a certain degree, I have to say, I found a little bit of internalized misogyny too in my mind as I was searching in all of this. A little bit, not perhaps to the extent of, the woman that you described. But yeah, there's a little bit of it, of course. So look, if we should always look for internalized racism, internalized anything, looking at how we relate to things. Where is the conceit of superiority? Where is the conceit of inferiority? Where is the conceit of equality too? Where is any conceit?
And Lilia asks, how can monks who have been trained for such a long time discriminate against other human beings? Where is the practice? Where is the compassion? Where is mindfulness? That is dukkha. Well,
I would say, first of all, not all monks, hashtag kind of like not all men, everybody's going to get triggered. No, but you have to say, this was one of the questions that obviously got me shaken on the path. And the truth is, that I'm still contemplating that. But it's also true that there are several different things to my understanding. One is 2,500 years after the Buddha. Two is that a lot of monastics and actually people, because this has nothing to do with whether they're robes or not robes. So there are individuals, monastics, that are incredibly developed, incredibly well skilled. Actually, when I went to Thailand, I met one of them. Like zero sexism, zero bullshit, even though he was raised in a sort of, if anything, he had all the kind of like, how do you say, all the excuses to act in a certain way based on a particular conditioning. But I've been treated actually in an entirely different way from a Western monk, not Bhante Sudason. A Western monk who had zero of that cultural conditioning, yet acquired a lot of these ideas from the system. So there are lots of different things that one needs to develop in the path. So if one has developed incredible samadhi, not necessarily they haven't developed incredible wisdom, for example, or attachment to a particular form of Buddhism. That is something that I also found, like that has been very difficult for me to accept, because I was attached to, say, a form like the Thai forest tradition. That was the form that I found in this lifetime, the first one, and I loved it straight away. And I thought that was the only thing that was great and awesome and perfect. So very obsessed with it. So it was very difficult for me to let go of the exact copy and paste form than the one that I had found. So of course, just with everything, there's lots of wholesome, but it's still part of samsara. So there's things that are less than perfect, less than ideal. So that's when it's important, I think, in our practice to remember that we should always practice critical thinking, not just accept things, but really question them. But also, very important, not to judge others, to call out unwholesome behaviors, but not to think less or more based on our ideas of what a practitioner has accomplished or what they haven't accomplished, but rather call out the behavior. It's not that all monks are great or all monks are awful or all lay people are great and all lay people are not great. Actually, we're studying this morning in the sutta. But rather, there are certain actions that are unwholesome and certain actions that are wholesome, certain mind states that are wholesome, certain mind states that are unwholesome. So we should address those. And to be clear, in the Buddhist world, I would say 99% of monastics, actually 100% of the monastics that I've met, outside of Buddhist insights, obviously, they never said that like women did not have the capacity for awakening. They said actually it was perfectly, acceptable. But there's different forms through which that awakening is allowed for you to be pursued. So that's where it becomes a little bit more complicated.
Okay. And Gabriela asks, I was born a woman and carry a lot of cultural baggage due to Marianismo. Yeah. She writes the counter to machismo.
Oh.
I've never heard this term.
Marianismo.
She says, and while I have rejected it by and large, I still have worries that it affects my sila. How can I ensure that I don't treat men and women in a bigoted way?
Well, I would say what has helped me. So that's where I find it very interesting to study, to find actual research, scholarly research on anthropological research, sociological research on whatever it is, whatever our bringing has been, like specific things. you don't have to become a PhD scholar, but just getting kind of a sort of idea of what your situation is, understand the causes and conditions, and then you know what to work on. Otherwise, good luck with that. I would still be, very confused about what my experience was as a woman in Buddhism, or as a woman in the West, or as a woman, raised in Italy. So we have lots of different ideas and we keep on like rolling in delusion. But unless we actually have things to work with, we're like, okay, well, it says that women, are indoctrinated to just clean. And I was like, okay, well, I don't really have that. Women are indoctrinated to be a little bit passive and not very confident at the sort of front end of things. And I was like, maybe there is some of that. Let me investigate it. So then you start investigating based on guidelines, but not on your ideas. Otherwise, my ideas were that I was perfectly happy doing whatever I was doing, which I was actually, nobody forced me to do anything.
And her second question, she says, there's a lot of Jataka stories with a lot of misogyny and some very late dated suttas which are clearly contaminated with cultural sexism from the time. How do we ensure that we practice the correct Dhamma and not something encumbered with wrong or incorrect teachings?
Yeah, that is, thank you for bringing that up. So that is actually when my sort of, when all these questions popped up. Because I was reading the suttas and I was full of joy and happiness. And then every now and then I would encounter some stuff that was like, whoa, this is weird. Misogynist, but also like when I read the Bakula Sutta, I was like, what the hell? How is this the description of an arahat? Like, I don't remember exactly what it says, but it was like, oh yeah, Bakula never helped any of his fellow monastics. Bakula was, I don't know, I don't remember. Do you remember Bante? Like different.
Well, one was he refused to teach the bhikkhunis. That was actually one of them.
Or anyone for that matter. Like it wasn't particularly gendered. There was one thing that was gendered, but most of it was just like he sounded like a really like self-centered, selfish person. So I was kind of like, well, that sounds a little bit different than everything else that I've read so far. How is it possible that these are fantastic qualities of an arahat? So we're very lucky these days, even though it's 2,500 years after the Buddha, and we're close to the apocalypse. So we have a magical thing called the internet, which we're using right now, by the way. So what I did was Bakula Sutta. I Googled and I found a lot of research from actually Venerable Analio, who pointed out how it was a later addition in the suttas. So unfortunately, we have to do the work. We have to do the research of looking for it. But I think it's also precious and a great opportunity to really investigate the Dhamma, to not, think, to not just read and take everything. That's such a lazy approach. We're like, oh, Bakula Sutta, yes, sadhu, 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 yes, yes. No, go like, wait, why is this different than something else that I read earlier or that I was presented to by a monastic? Asking questions. I was constantly asking questions about this. Like, it's not that, or anything. Don't rely only on one idea or one teacher or one sutta, but always constantly investigate, really understand it, see it for yourself. How can this be in accordance to Dhamma if it's so dissonant from the Dhamma?
And she clarifies that Marianismo is the cultural belief that a woman must endure the abuses and transgressions of men.
Oh, whoa, that sucks. Yeah, research it. I don't know much about it, and deconstruct it because it becomes less personal. This is what I noticed. This is the work that I've done with myself. Becomes more bearable. Both your tendencies and the tendencies of others who have those expectations on you. So you're like, okay, well, this is what is currently happening. And then actively look for a different place where to be, where to practice, where all of these things are not imposed to you on a regular basis. So, so yeah, Bhante and I have created our sort of safe space, and we're happy to practice in this way. And here for me, all of these issues, luckily, are not a problem because we decided for it not to be a problem, which makes it tolerable then to go about in the world when I have to go about in the world and have to endure it. But if I have to endure it every second, honestly, my practice is too weak for this. I'm not enlightened yet. I'm on the path towards awakening. But yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot. I'm not as strong as all my other fellow female monastics. They're much stronger, especially the ones, the pioneers. Like, seriously, I would have gone like, hi and bye and see you never. Like, yeah, it's intense.
Okay, so we have 5 minutes left, and there's still lots of comments and questions.
Zen questions.
So I'm going to skip over the comments, although there's some really amazing comments by Bhante Kaliko.
Oh.
He basically was like writing out a Dhamma talk on like a parallel Dhamma talk on the same topic, which is beautiful. There's lots of really lovely stuff in there. Let's see. But I'm going to focus on just picking out questions. Bradley says, how do you not let gender-based or other types of discrimination shake your faith in the Dhamma?
Yeah, very difficult. That's what I was sharing. It's very difficult. It was very difficult for me. I was very shaken. And actually, I was seriously contemplating about disrobing. So once again, in separating the two, distinguishing the two, there is the Dhamma, the teachings of liberation, and there are unenlightened behaviors of unenlightened people, including ourselves. There was a certain point, should I talk about this? Anyway, at a certain point, it so happened that at Buddhist Insights, I kind of was in a situation where I was dealing with a male monk. I'm trying to do a Bhante Sudazo story. And I didn't particularly like that monastic for no apparent reason, just because I met the person and I was just like, this monk, whatever. My defiled mind created those conditions. And I put him on the side during a sort of formal event. One, out of laziness, but two, out of kind of like, oh, who cares? And then I caught myself afterwards and I felt profound regret. And I went to Bhante and I confessed. And I saw the ugliness in my mind. Because I thought, well, look at that. I was in the position of privilege. I'm the woman and he's the white dude. So there's nothing, he's the privileged dude most of the time. But in that situation, the role was flipped. And I kind of oppressed him because I had the opportunity to do that. So it's always remembering how there's always this playing game. Victim, oppressor, victim, oppressor, victim, oppressor. So cultivating a very strong mind is practicing in accordance to Dhamma. So whether or not you're in a privileged or an unprivileged position, you always act skillfully. You always act in accordance to Dhamma. And then understanding that all the rest is done because we're all unenlightened. So we tend to, dwindle. So acknowledging the mistake and moving forward. And so also forgiving others for making really bad karma. Whenever people act unskillfully, they make really bad karma.
And Sally asks, as Ayyā mentioned, more male gender is mentioned in the sutta. Is that because ancient India was a patriarchal society? So, for example, the third precept is usually just mentions how males break the precept. Vice versa, female are the same, but I haven't seen this included in the suttas. Any thoughts?
It's because it's, once again, everything that we have is recorded mainly by males, so it's through that perspective. It's also why the majority of, the kind of the sexual relationships are talked about or spoken about in a heterosexual manner. It's not that like gay sex wasn't present in the time of the Buddha. It was alive and well. The Romans were pretty okay with that. Also, the Greeks. It was actually became taboo, for example, in my part of the world, with when Christianity became the official religion. But before that time, there was everybody's cool, with it, no problem. So it's not that it's not present, but that was whoever brought the history forward. It was heteronormative and male. So not taking it seriously. So like we have to also understand that the teachings of liberation are genderless. So always can be difficult sometimes, to overcome that. I didn't have a problem with that. Now I have the opposite problem that I'm kind of like, oh, I have to pay attention to this rather than not.
And Ro asks, how can we bring the Buddhist teachings to the transgender experience? I am a trans woman. I want to transcend my physical body. At the same time, it is the source of pain and disassociation.
Yeah, so once again, we have to first deal with conventional reality before we can transcend conventional reality and talk about then have the experience of absolute reality. So that's once again related what I was talking about in terms of I can say I could have said, oh, I have transcended gender already because like I didn't particularly identify as a woman. I had no problem checking the box as a woman, but I really didn't think too much about it. I identified more as Italian than as a woman. And I'm not particularly attached to being Italian either. Fante's rolling his eyes. So once again, we need to understand the nuts and bolts of our current situation and of our suffering. So if your current body, if you're not at peace with the current form of the body, you need to understand and investigate that. That is the investigation of conventional reality. And then you worry about, once that one is settled, then you figure out how to transcend it. This would be my recommendation. And of course, with the Buddhist path, you totally understand everything. None of this becomes taboo. Like everything becomes very much understandable of why we have gender dysphoria, why we have different sexual preferences. This is when you start understanding that it's not YOLO, but you only live multiple lives. YOLOT. That's great. Not YOLO, but YOLOT. Yeah, and then you're like, okay, well, this is the current situation. No big deal. Let me sort it out, and then I can transcend it.
And last question listed, Ty Flip says, thank you for this enlightening perspective. As an Asian woman in the middle of this pandemic, we are experiencing more discrimination. How do we mindfully respond to strangers who will hate?
I'm so sorry that you have to, first of all, deal with that. It's quite unfortunate. Remember, once again, that it has nothing to do with you, but it has to do with the greed, hatred, and delusion of others that we also have, of course, but in this case, that others are acting upon. And of course, the Buddhist teachings, the Buddha recommends the simile of the soul. So always to keep our mind full of loving kindness and compassion and understanding that really feeling bad for these people that are committing such bad karma. But if you are being abused and it's really hurtful and you can't keep your cool, also forgive yourself, because it is very difficult. So in that way, yeah, just do be compassionate towards yourself. Be kind towards yourself.
Okay, well, that's the last question. So thank you, Ayyā Somā, for the excellent talk. And thank you, all of you, for joining in and participating. And we'll see you tomorrow at 8 a.m. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.